Good morning. Welcome to Congress to Campus. This is a program that's co-sponsored by the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress and the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. We're just delighted that you've joined us today. My name is Larry LaRocco. I'm a former member of Congress from Idaho, and I also sit on the board of the Frank Church Institute. We are going to be joined today by two former members of Congress. And we're going to have a great discussion that's going to be moderated by President Tromp of Boise State University. We've had other Congress to Campus programs at Boise State. We had one last year in the era of COVID with Donna Edwards and Dennis Ross. And before that, we've had members of Congress come and visit our campus at Boise State University and spend a day and a half with students in the community. We hope to have the former members of Congress back on campus soon, but today we have them virtually. Today I want to thank sponsors of the Oppenheimer companies, Andrew Scoggin and Ivaca TV. You saw them profiled before that. Frank Church gave a lecture on war and peace early on at Boise State University, and the Frank Church Institute exists to honor his legacy and his public service. These programs are all about public service. We like to talk to our former members of Congress about public service and how we can talk to each other about democracy. The Frank Church Institute's theme is how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. And so these Fridays with Frank sessions that we have are geared to that theme. Today, as I mentioned, the session will be moderated by Dr. Marlene Tromp, a native of Wyoming, and she's the 7th president of Boise State University. Before joining BSU, Dr. Tromp was the campus provost and executive vice chancellor at the University of California of Santa Cruz. And before joining the University of California system, Dr. Tromp was the dean of Arizona State University's new Interdisciplinary College of Arts and Sciences and the vice provost of the university's West Campus. She's a first-generation college student. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Creighton University, a Master of Arts from the University of Wyoming, and a PhD in English from the University of Florida. Joining her today are two former members of Congress in alphabetical order are Brian Baird, Democrat from the state of Washington. He served in the House of Representatives for Washington's 3rd Congressional District from 1999 to 2011. He served on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Science and Budget Committee, as well as the Democratic Steering Committee and Senior Regional Whip. He's a former chairman of the Department of Psychology, Pacific Lutheran University. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Wyoming and is a licensed clinical psychologist. And then the other former member of Congress is Bob Goodlatte. He's a Republican from Virginia who served in the U.S. House of Representatives for Virginia's 6th Congressional District from 1993 to 2019. He served on the House Agriculture and Judiciary Committees, where he was chairman, as well as co-chairman of the bipartisan Congressional Internet Caucus. He currently represents the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability. He holds a JD degree from Washington and Lee University School of Law. Let's welcome all of you to the discussion of why Congress matters with Dr. Tromp. Dr. Tromp, I'm handing off to you, and thanks again to my colleagues for joining us here in Boise virtually. Dr. Tromp.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be a part of this Frank Church Institute event. I think this is really important work for us to be thinking through democracy and how democracies thrive and survive. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Congressman Baird and Goodlatte today. I'm really interested to learn that we've got another Cowpoke grad here too. Brian and Bob, I'd love to ask both of you to please tell us a little bit about your personal path to serving in Congress, because I think for a lot of folks on a college campus, understanding how someone made their way to a position of leadership, national leadership, really helps them imagine what their own path might look like.
Well, I'll start out, and not to take too much time. First, thank you, President Tromp, and thank you to the Frank Church Institute, and thank you to an organization that Brian and I are both active with, the United States Association of Former Members of Congress. About 800 of us, if you can imagine, former senators and House members who are involved in a variety of programs, primarily educational programs like this program, to inform people about the Congress and how it operates. And I was just talking to a law school student yesterday about my pathway to Congress. I took an hour to talk to him, so I'll just take a minute and say that for whatever reason, I think because my sister went to college in Washington, D.C., I grew up in Massachusetts, but I think visiting her, she was quite a lot older than me, and going to all the different, the Smithsonian, the Capitol, the White House, Mount Vernon, Arlington National Cemetery, just instilled something in me. And then as I became interested in the practice of law, I realized that was all about helping people solve problems. And as I became more involved with action in the political party, the Republican Party in my area of Virginia, I moved to Virginia to go to law school. I realized that's a very similar thing too. I worked for a congressman for 2 years as his district director, helping people with problems they have with government agencies. And so that instilled a desire in me to help people solve problems. And the first office I ran for was the Congress. I was very fortunate to win in that first election, and then served for a long time chairing 2 committees. But I think you have to have a good reason for wanting to serve. And to me, and I know Brian, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but Brian is very interested in encouraging people to volunteer and to encourage people to take leadership positions in our society. That's what inspired me to run, was just growing up, learning about what the Congress does, and then as a lawyer, helping people solve problems. And then as a candidate for Congress and working for a congressman, I realized that that's what members of Congress do as well.
That's wonderful. Brian?
Well, first of all, again, I'll echo Bob's thanks, and particularly President Trump. As a former University of Wyoming graduate as well, it's great to see you and to see with my good colleagues and friends as well. I grew up in a real small rural town, western Colorado, a place called Fruita, Colorado, west of Grand Junction. Went to University of Utah for undergraduate school. I majored in powder skiing, but somehow managed to get a degree as well. And then went to University of Wyoming to study clinical psychology. And it was a focus on rural and community mental health. My father and mom just really believed in public service. They, whatever was needed, they showed up for it, whether it was Lions Club or the hospital auxiliary or Scouts or Little League or whatever, they were there. And they just said, basically, look, if you're fortunate enough to live in this country, you have to give whatever talent and time and ability you have back. And the John F. Kennedy call, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, resonated with me, and I'm sure with Bob and a whole generation. And so that idea of how can we serve, and there are thousands of ways to serve. Congress is but one of those. And so I chose my profession of psychology as a way to serve. I volunteered a lot. And then, the opportunity arose where a seat that I thought was important to try to fill became available. And like Bob, my first race was Congress. I did not work my way up the often chain of legislature, et cetera. But it all really comes down to service. We are so incredibly fortunate to live in the United States of America, have the freedoms we do, the economic opportunity we do. But that sense of how can I help make a difference is the main fundamental calling for pretty much everything I do. But it was certainly the case in Congress.
It's just really powerful to hear both of you talk about service and problem solving and making a difference in the world as being such a key driver. We are so profoundly politically polarized at this moment. And I'm curious, as students of congressional history and US history and people who served, as you look at that polarization and you think about the ways that it's operating in the country right now, do you view it as a historical cycle, are we in a different place than we've been in historically? How do you read that polarization right now in this moment?
Brian, I'll yield to you on this one since I went first on the last one.
All right, sure. We'll swap that way, Bob. Thanks. Well, I think it's certainly been worse than at any time that I was in Congress, and it was a little rough then. There was, as we dealt with the Affordable Care Act, we had some pretty tough town halls. I had one in which we had an ambulance parked behind the stage in case I got shot to death, so that was not a good thing. But the one of the problems that's happening now is if you look at the literature and the research on polling, it's not just people are identifying more with one party, it's that they hate the opposite party. So much of our media advertising and paid advertising, I'm not criticizing the media, too much of that is done. But the division of people into, I watch this TV program for my news and I watch this one and your news is wrong and my news is right. That's a trend that is unusual in electronic media. In the early days and throughout our country, there have been newspapers that led one way or another, that leaned one way or another. But the level of viciousness, I mean, we've had this last week, a member of Congress posted online a joke, in quotes, cartoon suggests showing him killing another member of Congress. That's absurd. And so we've got to somehow be respectful, collegial, understand that our side we may agree with, but that doesn't mean the other side is wrong about everything. And it certainly doesn't mean they're evil, awful people who must be destroyed. And that seems to be the attitude now. And we've got to get past that because our adversaries have fomented a lot of that. You know, the Russians especially were helping generate that in our country to their credit and our demise. And we have to stop that.
Thank you.
Well, first, let me say I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I went to Sumner Avenue Elementary School, which was named for Charles Sumner, the great abolitionist senator who was almost caned to death on the floor of the Senate by a congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks. So there definitely have been times in our history, and that was an event that was right before the Civil War, when what was going on in the Congress was reflected writ large in our country. And I think that to a certain extent, that is the case as well. But I think we have a new problem today that has exacerbated this tremendously. And that is the internet. As Brian noted, people tend to get into their own echo chamber, their own sources of information, and then they gravitate toward what they want to hear and shut out not hearing things from other people. The Congress has gotten worse, as Brian notes, but not nearly as bad as it is if you look on the internet about what individual citizens are saying about each other. We still work hard to maintain a sense of decorum. When you give speeches on the floor, you refer to your colleague or your good friend, and we follow very close rules that require that words be taken down, meaning removed from the record if you say something that is inappropriate, both on the floor of the House and in committee debates. All of these are very important, and they just simply are lost in an internet where people have a certain sense of removal from the other people they're talking to, and sometimes a certain sense of anonymity about it. And then when you have the ability to not only hear all of that, but then send it to thousands of your friends, and then and so on, you can quickly spread false information. You can quickly spread malice, and we've got to come up with a cure for that. And I'm not sure the Congress has the answers. It's going to primarily come from decent people who say, this is no longer the way I want to get information. This is no longer the way I want to communicate with other people. But it has become a very, very serious problem on the internet. And then that generates pressure on a lot of institutions, the Congress being one of them, where people in the Congress simply are afraid to say, I'm working with Congressman Brian Baird of the other party to come up with a solution to a problem where working together, we might find that solution, because then people attack that other congressman, Congressman Bob Goodlatte, and say, well, he's just a rhino. He's a Republican in name
Right.
only. He doesn't reflect my values. And it makes members of Congress much more cautious about the necessary process in legislating of working together with people you don't agree with. So the first step is being willing to talk to people that you don't agree with. And again, the internet simply doesn't foster that the way it operates on many of these social media sites today.
It's so interesting to me that both of you have mentioned not just social media, but the influence social media has on the way that people think. And a colleague of mine shared a very interesting piece of information from this massive release of files on Facebook. And one of the most intriguing things that he discovered in that was that you would receive 7 times the rate of upgrading your post if you got an angry emoji than if you got a like. So they were actually favoring and giving greater weight to posts that produced rage, which really fosters the kind of phenomenon that you're both describing. So if social media is one element to this, but as you know, Bob, it's been true across our history. There have been moments where we've had this level of conflict. Are there things that we can do to help actually give, as you said, Bob, we've got to talk to each other, but are there other things that we can do to help talk with one another to ensure that life of that democracy?
Well, I believe education can play a very, very important role in this, and not starting at college or university level, but starting in kindergarten practically. Everybody now has access to these devices. They're wonderful, wonderful tools for people to communicate with each other, for people to get to be educated, for people to communicate with family, for people to play and shop and a whole host of other things. But they've also become tools, and as you've noted, some of the companies that make these platforms available make more money if their algorithm picks up on things that are controversial and amplifies those things. And the result of that, of course, is that it simply encourages more and more and more of the same behavior. Not only does the company profit from it, but an individual who's trying to get their voice out finds that their voice will grow further if they say nasty things, if they take an angry approach to things, and that simply is not good. So I think at every level of education, there should be a portion of that education dedicated to the importance of understanding the truth and making sure that people know how to find that out on the internet, to have more than one source of information, to look to some of the sites that will help you verify whether something you heard is true, and to encourage people to use those sites, because you can find the truth in many instances right now. And then the other thing I would say is that it's really, really important for people to understand that they need to learn how, at every age, how to talk to people respectfully that they do not agree with, because no matter what you're doing in your life, whether it's serving in the United States Congress or whether it's simply getting along with your fellow employees at work, being able to communicate with people in a collegial manner, even if you don't particularly care for that person, be able to talk to them about things that you're trying to work through is a really important skill that I think the internet is not doing a good job of teaching.
Yeah, I would build on what Bob said. I absolutely agree. And I think there's an element of respectful curiosity, meaning I want to understand where you're coming from versus let me tell you why you're wrong and I'm right. And related to that, I think a willingness to evaluate our own side's perspectives objectively, as objectively as we can. What is good about what we have to say, what might be flawed. And then also when we dialogue with people, to try to say what can we agree on? I mean, we tend to define ourselves now in American politics by what we disagree on. Are you pro-gun, anti-gun, pro-choice, anti-choice, pro-immigration, anti-immigration? And it's binary, right? It's as if is if we just sort into two camps and you have to be right on all the camps, and both sides do it to some extent. Bob talked about if you collaborate with the Democrat and you're on the Republican side, you're called a rhino. The same thing can happen on the Democratic side. I would co-sponsor bills. I had a bill to allow that there would be the rapid harvest of timber after a forest fire because the wood is still good. Bugs haven't gotten to it yet. We've had massive fires in the West. We need the wood to build houses. It sinks the carbon in a thing called a house versus in something that decays. I sponsored it with a dear friend, neighbor, Greg Walden. His district's across the border. Greg was high up in the Republican Party. Bob served with him. He's a great guy. Some of my environmental friends said, I can't believe you're working with Walden. And it's like, as if Walden were an evil voice that shall not be named. Voldemort, we'll call him. He wasn't. He's a really decent, wonderful guy. We both represented timber country. They needed jobs. We needed wood. We worked together. But people sometimes were not willing to look at the substance of the bill. They just wanted to label the bill good or bad based on the person who was involved. And we've got to find, can we work together? Can we bring some common sense? Can we even agree on the facts and solve the problems together that way? And that can start in college. That can start in our families.
Thank you both for that. I think that's so critically important. And we've certainly been arguing that universities should be a place where even really deep disagreements can be discussed. And that I think that's a part of what we have a responsibility to teach people. And so I feel a sense of grief when I see people unable to have meaningful dialogue with each other. Now, the 2020 presidential election had a record turnout, and we would historically have said that's the sign of a thriving democracy. That's a democracy that is doing very well. But there was so much frustration and anger and so many different narratives around the election, people distrusting our election processes and efforts to change the way voting happens from both the left and the right. There's just this outpouring of concern. What are your thoughts on where we are in terms of our engagement in the democracy? And do the things that you've already talked about relate to that?
Well, I'm pretty concerned about the fate of the democracy right now. One of the big concerns I have is apparently fairly concerted efforts to make it harder for people to vote. I think that's a mistake. And there's tendency to say, if our side wins, then our obligation is to make it sure we will win again. And by how we draw the district lines, how we qualify or reject voters, the mechanisms we use for elections. If you believe in a constitutional democratic republic, which I believe in, you really should try your best to make sure that everybody eligible can actually vote and that their vote is counted freely and fairly and accurately. And that once that happens, you respect the outcome of the vote and you move on from there. And we have drifted away from that. People are making it harder for folks to vote, making it more complicated. And we've got election officials whose lives are threatened because they've counted votes. And that's got to stop. And if we don't do that, then the process is in serious jeopardy. And good people have to stand up and say, this doesn't matter what color jersey we wear. This matters about the most fundamental things in the democratic republic. Do people who are eligible have a right to vote? Does their vote get counted fairly? And then do we accept the results of the election? That shouldn't be controversial, but it is right now.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. I would offer a little bit greater note of optimism because here in Virginia, it's one of two states, the other being New Jersey, where we have our gubernatorial election in the year immediately following the presidential election. So we just completed that. And my optimism doesn't stem from the fact that a Republican was elected governor for the first time in a dozen years here in Virginia, but because of the campaign that he ran, in which I just watched a program yesterday by one of his media people. They created 47 television ads for Glenn Youngkin, the winning candidate for governor, and not one of them mentioned Joe Biden. They were not trying to build this campaign. I think they benefited from the difficulties that President Biden and the Democrats were having in Washington leading right up to that election. But they ran, and I won't say it's totally positive, because they ran negative ads about the Democratic candidate, just as the Democratic candidate ran negative ads about Governor-elect Youngkin. But he's focused on Virginia issues, and he campaigned in every corner of the state and raised the vote level for his, compared to previous Republican candidates for governor, in every part of the state. And I think that has been noted, and I hope that it's a guide for people in campaigns across the country next year on how to move past what happened just recently, culminating in what happened on January 6th, which I find reprehensible. That was, a terrible episode in American history. And we have to find a way past it. But this was not about let's continue the fight to find a way past it. This was let's focus on getting things done. It carried through to our candidate for lieutenant governor, attorney general. They all won, and Republicans retook the state legislature. That's, in my opinion, a bit of a sign that we can move past the worst of where we were. It doesn't, however, solve this problem of how people are able to communicate. The word retweet didn't exist until Twitter came along, but it's emblematic of the ability of people to share information with other people instantaneously, and it builds up people on the internet who are the people who generate this information. So that, for example, during this pandemic that is still going on, hopefully we're heading in a better direction on it. But it made people on the internet who are both on the right and the left, who are most assuredly not health experts, widely followed about whether you should be vaccinated or not, whether you should wear a mask or not, and a whole host of other related issues where the sources of information, even amongst medical professionals, there are differences of opinion about certain things. But to have some of the most influential people being people who are totally unqualified to share information about this, I think made the pandemic much worse. Brian and I were just in South Korea a few months ago. I don't know much about the political aspects of handling COVID-19 there, but I do know that people were following guidelines much more closely than they were here in the United States, and having even though they had a difficulty getting access to the vaccine there, they had a much better experience in terms of death rates and so on as here in the US. So freedom of speech is vitally important in any country, but having that freedom reflected by it being about what is true and accurate is a critical component of that. And we need to figure out how to make sure that when people communicate with each other, there's some consequence for not telling the truth.
Bob, I fully agree. I think you make a great point about the importance of positive campaigns and trying to put forward a vision. The one thing I did have concern about the Virginia race, and I have concern about so much of what's happening in our politics, is the refusal to actively confront demagoguery and challenges to our democratic institution. I mean, what happened on January 6th was, apart from the Civil War, was unprecedented, and it really was awful. And if we don't call it awful, as you did, and I respect that very much, and I respect you very much, as you know, I worry if candidates are going to somehow try to finesse and act like, well, we just won't talk about that. I mean, it's a really dangerous thing what's happened with the vaccines right now. I mean, we don't have polio. You don't see a person in America with polio anymore. Maybe one or two, but they've been for a long time back. They got infected. If we're going to start saying that the choice whether or not to get a scientifically proven vaccine is now an indication of your political righteousness, that's really profoundly dangerous. And when we do the same with climate change and we say, well, if you believe in climate change, then that's bad science, when the best scientists in the world say it's right. And I used to chair the science committee. I could walk you through the whole batch of science on this if you wanted, but I worry that we've now got at least some portion of our politics saying that we're not going to listen to the best available research evidence, that we're going to deny facts, that we're going to have our own sources of information, that somehow, as you point, Bob, some knucklehead on the internet or some politician even stands up or on talk radio says something that's totally false. People die as a result of it. Maybe the radio hosts themselves die, but that's still okay politically. Somehow we've got to get past that. We've got to have people on both sides of the aisle willing to confront demagoguery and false information.
Well, I completely agree with that, but I think Glenn Youngkin got a lot of credit. He got attacked by some people, but he got a lot of credit for saying, look, Joe Biden won that election.
Yeah.
He got credit for saying people should not have invaded the U.S. Capitol. And I think he then got credit for moving beyond that and saying, but we have all these problems that have to be addressed. And here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, fair point.
Our candidate for governor. And I think it was an effective demonstration of how you can take the right stand, but not dwell on that. He does have to get the votes to win an election.
Yeah.
And he found the best way to do that was to talk about his vision for Virginia, not about who was right or who was wrong in the past, other than make it clear where he felt that lay. And he did make that clear.
I think we've seen, and I think both of you have really alluded to this, that there are often situations or subjects now that people don't discuss with each other. And, as we approach the holiday season, and families come together, there's always been a joke that people and families sometimes disagree politically. And so they're trying to navigate around those issues. But I do think that you've both also pointed out that if we can't talk to each other, we're not going to find meaningful solutions to real problems, whether those are local problems or national problems. And we do have to discover ways to do this. And you've both talked about the role of educating people in that and getting people to think about service as being critical to that. So thank you for, really, there's such coherence to the things that you're arguing. As we look at the Congress, and of course, I'm sure that anytime you've served, you continue to watch what's going on and reflect on your experience and what it looks like now. Do you think Congress is, as our founding fathers would have had it function? Do you think that there are things that are inhibiting our success in Congress, things like the filibuster that often get critiqued, or are those things a valuable tool for democracy? Are there other elements? What are your thoughts about the functioning of Congress right now?
Well, I think the biggest problem that the country faces politically, frankly, is twofold. One, money. The amount of money that we spend on campaigns is obscene. The amount of time we have to spend. If you're in a swing district, you spend a tremendous amount of your time trying to raise money. And that ultimately has the potential to compromise your integrity. Not that you get the money in your pocket, that's against the law. But if you need it to campaign, there's pressure to take certain stands one way or another. You can't have an overt, it's illegal to make an overt quid pro quo, like if you do this, we'll give you this contribution. But people factor in the awareness that positions you take on issues can affect your campaign contributions. There's no question about that. And it spends too much time and gives a few people, super wealthy people or organizations, too much influence. And so one problem is money. A second is the issue that Bob's talked about, and I totally agree with the compartmentalization and algorithm-driven divisiveness of our society is there. And then the third thing is structurally, the Congress has become, on the one hand, the Congress has relinquished, I believe, too much of its authority to the executive branch. The Constitution makes Congress the Article 1, and it says all legislative powers herein granted. It puts that in the role of the Congress, and we've ceded too much to the executive. But in addition to that, within the Congress, the leadership in both parties, maybe a little less so in the Republican side than my own side, the Democratic side, the leadership has taken too much control over the Congress itself, and the average rank and file member and the committee structure has too little input. So those three things are weakening us as an institution, I fear.
I think Brian has touched on a very important point in terms of the functionality of the Congress. I wouldn't begin to presume to tell the Senate exactly how to change their rules, but I do know that every year, no matter whether this year may be an exception, but every year that I was in Congress, whether Republicans were the majority or Democrats were the majority, the House passed hundreds of bills that went to a graveyard called the United States Senate because their rules made it very, very difficult to pass legislation. And the old way of, well, we'll come together by way of compromise, I'm not sure the old way really was the old way and worked all that well. But it certainly today in this current polarized environment makes it extraordinarily difficult for individual members to say, I've got a good idea, let me take it to the rest of, first to my committee, and then if I can convince my committee members to pass it out, take it to the full floor of the House and I can convince them to pass it. That still can happen. It certainly did happen while I was there. But then it goes over to the United States Senate, and if a senator says, well, I like that idea in the House, or I've got one of my own, it's a completely different process there for trying to put together the necessary votes. And you either have to get every single senator to agree and have no one basically threaten to filibuster, because it's the threat of the filibuster that kills most legislation, because they don't have time to work through that process to avoid having votes brought up. So I don't say this because I don't like the idea that both the Senate and the House should look carefully at legislation before it's passed. But I do want to suggest that in a democracy, particularly a representative democracy like the United States, the number one institution listed first in the Constitution in Article 1 is the Congress. It's the first among equals between the executive branch and the judiciary and itself. And yet its ability to put a check against any executive, or its ability even to counter or legislate in response to judicial decisions that may strike down legislation for various reasons, has been severely hampered. And when the federal government is as big as it is, and it's far bigger than I think it should be, and spends as much money as it does, and it spends far much more money than I think it should spend, when you have all those responsibilities, there are things about the functionality of the Congress that are impairing its ability to take that preeminent role.
It's interesting as I listen to you talk and that you raise these really critical issues, and in many ways you're nuancing the complexities of a body like Congress and the ways in which all these other factors play into it as well. But I also hear both of you expressing hopefulness too. Would you describe our democracy right now as fragile, strong, someplace in between?
Well, I wouldn't say it's fragile. I wouldn't say it's strong. I would say it's somewhere in between. But it does very much concern me that it's not heading in the right direction. Many democracies are based upon a parliamentary system. Use the across Europe and elsewhere, but let's use the United Kingdom as the example. There, the majority party in the Congress is totally dominant. The Prime Minister is not only the head of the Parliament of the House of Commons, he is also the head of the executive branch, if you will, of the government, and his leading fellow members of the Parliament are the cabinet officials who help administer the laws passed by the Parliament. Now, that's an efficient system, but it's not a system, in my opinion, that works particularly well when the minority party, whoever they are, has effectively no voice. They are the opposition. They have the opportunity to question the prime minister. They will vote against the measures in the Parliament, but that's about it. And that's where our system of government is headed, except that ours isn't even designed to work effectively that way. If you have a system where everybody's expected, because of pressure from the outside, because of this activity generated by the internet, that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and your party votes because that's the right answer, and the other party votes the other side because they think that's the right answer. And then you hopefully have the ability to do that in the other body, the equally powerful United States Senate, which has bestowed upon itself even greater power because of the cloture rules, the supermajority required to cut off debate. And then you have to rely on having a president of your own party who will sign into the law. The way things have been going lately, even when you have all three like that, doesn't, as the Democrats have right now, doesn't create a lot of functionality. And so I don't want to go to that parliamentary system, but I do think some reforms need to be made in our current system to make it easier for individual members of a legislative body to get action taken on their work. And then something needs to be done through education, through maybe some kind of effort to ensure that information you get on the internet is accurate, is true, that would assure that when people have ideas and want to work across the aisle together, that they can do so in a way that's respected and that will result in the kind of legislation that's carefully thought through and leads to reforms that improve our society. That's not happening today.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Bob was saying about the need for structural changes that allow individual members to work together through the process. That's the vision you have when you go there. I'll come with some ideas. I'll learn from others. I'll find some folks with common interests. We'll have some subcommittee hearings. People provide constructive feedback. We'll try to improve it. Maybe we don't pass or win every time, but we at least can bring it up, and then we'll perfect it through the process. So I think we do need to do that structural reform. A couple other points, though, I think. One, the Congress, everybody loves to say, oh, gosh, the Congress is lower than tapeworm or something as in its popularity ratings. And the polling says people love to hate Congress. But, the Congress is a manifestation of where we're at as a country. Most members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are pretty good people. Part of what's happened, though, is we're now not asking so much about what kind of person is this. When people are, where do you stand on this issue or that issue, or more easily, even, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Not even who are you? What kind of person are you? What motivates you? What are your values? It's just, what jersey do you hold? Currently, and I think it's almost an all-time low, there are only 16 members of the House who represent districts where the presidential race went the other way than the congressional race. 16 out of 435 voting members. That's a microscopic fraction. I used to be in such a district. I was a Democrat. A lot of folks voted Republican. I carried the vote. They would say, well, it's because I trust Brian. It wasn't because, well, I'm not going to vote for that SOB. He's a Democrat, or he or she's a Republican. It was, they got to know who I was. They knew I worked hard. I told the truth and did my best. But now it's sort of like, I don't even care about that. I just want to know whose side you're on, because once I know whose side you're on, that's shorthand for how you stand on 4 issues, 5 issues, no more than that. The other issue that's a challenge is, and that's exacerbated by presidential races. You see all these presidents running for office, and they say, if elected, I will do this. I will do this. They've never read the Constitution. All legislative powers granted herein shall be vested in a Congress. They're not in the president. The president, he'll say, I'll do this, I've done this, I did this. The truth is, we need a functional Congress. It needs to be made up by people dedicated to service with capability on both sides, and they work together. And the last thing I really want to say to students especially is, don't let the cynicism and negativity be contagious to you. It's just too darn easy to say everybody in Congress is corrupt. They're all just in it for the money. They only care about power, blah, 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 blah. Too easy. Most members of Congress are decent, hardworking people who are doing their best for their constituents and for the country. Don't support demagogues, that's for sure. But don't just assume that because somebody's in the other jersey than you like, they're bad people and that you shouldn't listen to them?
You know, I served in the Congress for 26 years. I got scores of bills passed where I was the original sponsor of the legislation. And of course, many, many more as chairman of 2 committees, moving those committees' legislation out to be passed by the full House of Representatives. Not one of the bills that I introduced myself ever became law unless it had bipartisan support. Sometimes it had lots of Democrats supporting my initiative, and it passed overwhelmingly. Sometimes it only had a few Democrats supporting it, but enough to get it across the finish line and enough to make Democrats in the Senate take a look at it, so that it had to get through the Senate as well, and it had to have bipartisan support there for sure. And so and I left the Congress just 3 years ago, and some really important bills that I worked on, like criminal justice reform and reforming our music licensing laws, 2 major issues we dealt with in the Judiciary Committee right toward the end. They got through that process and were signed into law by President Trump. Those bills show that you can still operate that way, but even in just the 3 years since I left, it's gotten worse. So I'm looking for signs that things are capable of getting better. And I really hope that people will understand that what the American people really want to hear about are what you're going to do to solve problems, and not, as Brian says, which jersey you're wearing. That's not to say that I'm not a dedicated, diehard Republican. I am, and I'm a conservative Republican. But I also know that no one has the exact right answer to anything. And when I put forward an idea, I always put it forward with the idea that somebody else is going to poke holes in it. Somebody's going to say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, this just won't work. And that I would have to listen to them. And if I agreed with something that they were saying, or even if I would rather not have done it, but realize that in order to accomplish something, I had to make a tweak to the bill to get it to the next level, to get it through the process, that I had to be prepared to do that and have an intelligent discussion with people who wanted to do it a little bit differently about finding a way that we could move forward. That's not a difficult concept. And I'll say again, it's a concept you're going to experience in every aspect of your life, whether it's what you do at work, whether it's solving problems in your own family, whether it is something that's going on in your community that you're involved with, or a civic organization, or a club, or a sport that you participate in. Problems arise and they're solved by people being encouraged to sit down and talk through them and figure out a way forward. It's not a new concept. It's a concept that has improved, quite frankly, over hundreds of years, but now it's at threat because instead of having dialogues with people, you see it sometimes. You'll be in a restaurant and you'll see a group of people sitting around, and every one of them's looking at their phone. Sometimes they're texting with each other, but they're not having a dialogue as much as they should. So it's really important for people to talk with each other. And sure, you're going to have your friends, but understand that if somebody disagrees with you, there are solutions to these problems that you can talk through. Congress is a prime example of that, but the problems in the Congress are not caused by the Congress so much as they are symptoms of problems in society.
President Trump, let me add to that a little. I agree very much with what Bob's saying. One of the sad things about our political process right now is that, in my judgment, a very fair and constructive question would be to a candidate, will you work with the other side to solve problems? To me, the default answer should be yes. The fact that it's no in many cases right now is a huge problem. And as you know, and I'll take a brief second to plug this, I'm working to create a National Museum and Center for Service. And part of the reason I want to do that is because, first and foremost, it is fundamental to our democratic republic. If you're not elected to serve, then to serve others, to serve the greater good, you're there for the wrong reason. We have differences of opinion about what that's defined at, but in every case where we've tried to export democracy, If people haven't gotten elected and said, I'm here to serve others, to serve the greater good, to serve the future, then they begin to use that democratic veneer for self-interest and venal purposes or power, and it fails. The democracy fails. The other reason is that we need something to unite around as a country. In my district, we had 200-year floods in the 12 years I was there. An old timer said, man, I must be getting old. I've lived through 200-year floods. But when those floods came, everybody turned out to help. One election, I was trained in whitewater rescue, so I was a whitewater kayaker. I went out on election day and rescued people from their homes in full rescue gear. I didn't ask them how they were going to vote. I just put them in the boat, right? It was, and the point being, when something is in crisis, we're supposed to set aside our differences and work together. Rotary does that every day. Red Cross does that every day. They don't ask how you stand on guns or abortion or immigration or whatever. They just say, what skills can you bring to helping others? And I think we need to find that ethos again, where we say, what can we agree on? What are the shared challenges we face? You've got some ideas for how to approach it. I've got some ideas. Let's work together for the greater good. But that, especially talking to young people at universities and colleges, never forget that ethos of service and the purpose that goes with it. It's not about winning. It's not about proving your side is better. It's about seeing real life problems, understanding them from multiple perspectives, and working together to solve them.
You've both spoken so passionately and persuasively about how critical it is for us to be able to be in dialogue with one another and to really work together, and how that's fundamental to democracy. Is there anything that you could name, any specific material thing that you could name? So we've talked a lot about the philosophical things. Are there material things that we could do differently that would help people be more likely to engage in that kind of democratic, collaborative process?
When you mean we, do you mean as a country or as a university? Sorry about this.
I think as a country.
Well, I think if, Bob's points about it starts at the individual level. The individual has to start modeling it, and we have to find ways to work together. And I think we need fundamental structural changes in how we run elections and how we interact within the Congress. I think we need to stop just focusing on the negative, divisive stuff and trying to find that kind of common ground. I think our colleges and universities play a role in that, a critical role, but it's not just colleges and universities. Not everybody goes to colleges and universities. We need it, but it can't be just education. It's a cultural change. The cultural change that says we should not hate one another. That shouldn't be hard, but that should be part of it. We should not hate one another. We should find common ground. We should understand the experience of others. The inner city kid or adult from New York City needs to understand what the folks in rural Idaho face, and the folks in rural Idaho need to understand what the folks in the deep South face, etc., and literally understand it viscerally. And then once you have that empathy and respect, then you can work together.
Bob, anything you would add to that?
Well, I really do think a program at every level, or even just a part of the curriculum, certainly in any political science course, but probably in a lot of other subjects in sociology and psychology and other places, where a frank discussion takes place about what is a dominant piece of virtually everyone's life today, and that is what they're seeing and hearing and learning on the internet, and just challenging them to say, okay, well, is that true or is it not true? And how do you figure that out? That's one thing. And then second would be to say, challenging people to reach out and communicate with people that, they didn't gravitate toward because of a common thought or common theme, but maybe there's a problem in society and they have a totally different point of view about it. So talking about these things from the not just a conflict resolution approach, but a practical approach of how are you using the tools available to you on the internet, and are you thinking about whether there are other ways to get get at information, and other people you should be communicating with about how to use that information.
Let me give two quick examples of that, maybe three.
Mhm.
One, Bob and I know this example painfully well. There's a thing that circulates on the internet that says, no wonder everybody's angry at Congress. Do you know the following, in quotes, facts about Congress? They retire immediately on full federal pension, and they get full salary even if they've only served a day. Their kids get free college education wherever they want to go. They don't pay into Social Security and Medicare. They get free health care and free housing while they're in Congress. Every single one of those statements is patently false, absolutely false. And yet I'm sure Bob had constituents who were in high dudgeon, outraged at this abuse. And the email circulation always says, send this to everyone you know so that they can rise up and stop this. I've talked to people on the street who confront me with my kids, my little kids in the time, and say, I'm going to tell you why I'm so pissed off at you SOBs, right? And I said, well, sir, if all of that were true, you'd have a right to be pissed off. But the fact is, every single point you raised is factually inaccurate, demonstrably factually inaccurate. And he said, well, we're going to just have to agree to disagree. No, your facts are wrong. And the point I make there is you have to be willing to ask, what are the facts behind this? And not just say, I'm going to try to find the facts that prove it true. Take climate, for example. Somebody might, instead of saying, is climate change real or is climate change not real, say, what evidence is it that the scientists have come up with? What processes have they analyzed that cause them to believe this? What's the chain of reasoning and empirical evidence? The same is true of vaccines. If you want to go to your whack job sources or whatever who say, oh, vaccines have, luminescent tracers in you, or Bill Gates has put some kind of microchip in them. Okay, but you've got, not okay, it's nuts. But you've got an obligation to say, how does the mRNA vaccine work? And how did they come up with this over decades and decades of studies? And how many people were tested? And oh, by the way, how does that testing protocol compare to some knuckle who says if you give horse medicine to somebody, that'll cure it? You've got to be willing to ask that question. And if you're not, man, that kind of intellectual laziness and bias is troublesome, because people die. People die of it.
That first example that Brian used of there was an email that circulated, maybe it still does, but for years and years, it circulated very strongly, giving a lot of false information about retirement benefits and housing and healthcare benefits and so on for members of Congress. And so much so that we actually put on our website the latest information about the false information that was being circulated. And it truly is a problem because as the old adage, a lie will circle the globe, a dozen times while the truth is still putting on its shoes. But people need to understand that the lie hurts them. Yeah. Even if they're perpetuating it themselves unknowingly, the lie hurts them and it hurts our society as a whole. And teaching people how to discern what the truth is a really, really critical part of the education process.
Such an important insight. We are just about out of time. If I could ask both of you to share very briefly anything that you would say, any last word of wisdom you would give to students interested in public service.
Well, in spite of all the discouragement you may have heard, my first response to that is do it. It is so important for people to be engaged, and to run for public office, as Brian and I have done, requires some basic skills, two of which are you have to like people, number one. If you don't like people, and I mean people of all backgrounds and all different points of view, you really need to have that. And secondly, you got to have a thick skin to deal with all of these slings and arrows that I've referenced. Fortunately, I had both of those and truly enjoyed my service because I had unlimited opportunities to help people in all kinds of ways in their lives, with individual problems they were having with government agencies, to helping solve problems for communities, to taking on some of the greatest challenges we face as a nation. You don't have to run for office, though, to be involved in helping your community. You can volunteer with an unlimited number of organizations that do that. You certainly should vote, but you can do more than voting. You can be actively engaged in promoting somebody that you think would be a good candidate for public office. So I would absolutely strongly encourage people to get engaged and help us solve these problems that we've talked about today.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, I would
briefly.
echo that. A couple of things. Please never give in to hatred or cynicism. The cynicism in the sense that everybody's bad, where everybody's in it for themselves, nobody's here for the greater good. It's false, and it's really dangerously false. Find a personal way that you can commit to making the world a better place. Do it with humility, do it with integrity, do it with courage and persistence, and you will make a difference. And be willing to work with folks from different perspectives, to listen and to try to better yourself. If you do that, we have a really pretty potentially bright future. And don't give in to this idea that again, that everybody's bad. There are lots and lots and lots of good people out there, and make the most of the amazing talents and skills and opportunities you've got. If somebody's at this university, they are fortunate. They've got opportunities that most of the world never, ever has. And that carries with it a duty to use the intellect and use the talents and resources to make things a better place. So thank you. And Bob, always it's a pleasure to be with you. And thanks to everybody who put this event on.
Well, thank you, Congressman Baird and Congressman Goodlatte. You have been a model for that civil dialogue on really important and critical issues. Something we're really interested in lifting up the Frank Church Institute that we want to teach at the university. And it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. Well, Frank Church was a model of everything we've said.
Thank you both.
Thank you.